Hi, I'm Matthew. I work at Hi, Jordan. I work at Volition, unfortunately with Jordan. We like to say that we are the quantitative and qualitative people at Volition, and I say I am the qualified and he is the unqualified person at Volition. That is just our own little back and forth. Today I'm going to talk to you about what we do, not explicitly in user research, because that is much more Jordan's area, but I'm going to talk about how our telemetry system and how it's built informs our user research. So Volition has been a while without a title, so I'm going to be dodging some of this conversation, but I hope you'll all appreciate that and give me some slack. Realistically, the user research cycle is exactly as you might expect it at any of your studios, I assume. You know, we do iterative testing throughout the course of development of a project, and we do some post-market testing to look at, DLC, things like that. So to that end, as data scientist, which is one of those titles that means something completely different at every studio, it's like janitor, I don't know. Anyway, I do some very, very odd things. First, I'm going to start off by telling you a little about me. So they gave me a promotion lately, but it's one of those side motions where it's like you get a different title and no extra money, but you get a lot more work. So now I am the telemetry lead at Volition, whatever that means, but it's good. I used to be an academic, spent a lot of time phrasing questions at conferences as tacit attempts to plug my own work. I still do that. And this is my wife looking at me as she normally does. We don't have a whole lot of time, so I'm going to go over these things pretty quickly. So basically, just going to talk really briefly about what we do at Volition. This is obviously a user research audience, so I'm going to skip the what is user research talk I normally give. And I'm going to talk about observational effects, which you're all aware about, and how we use telemetry to mitigate some of those observer effects that so often plague our observational data. And I'm going to make sure that I quietly stab in a few shots at people who use observational guides with a checklist still. Nicely. You can argue with me later. So, we like to think what we do at Volition is create a zoo for players to play in. The kind of zoo where you can shoot things, and people, and strippers out of cannons. That is our, bread and butter. We are the only place I have ever worked where there is a real giant purple dick on the wall. And that has filled me with a certain kind of pride in my Ph.D. $100,000 worth of education, and I sit in front of a cock. This is my life. So, it's the comedy hour here. So E.L. Thorndike up here is an old psychologist and educator, and he had this theory called the theory of identical elements, which you may or may not be aware of. If any of you have any psych background, this has been hammered into you by your professor while you sleep in the back. The theory of identical elements posits that if we're training somebody to do something, we should recreate the situation in which they're going to do the thing to the most identical way possible to get the most salient learning experience. It was tested primarily in simulation, in CPR training, and in all kinds of high-risk stuff. So obviously we don't do super high-risk stuff at Volition. Well, I mean, we do to our own careers, but not to other people. So consequently, that's not necessarily the most relevant, but what we like to do is create a living room, so to speak, a place where people can play the game together often. We had someone a few weeks ago doing some screen cheating, where they were looking at the person next to them. And this is, ordinarily you look at a user research setup where there are strict cubicle pieces between each person's thing, you want this individual play, but because of the type of open world games we create, we want to see people screen cheat. That's something you're going to do. We want to see people talk to each other. It might limit it if it gets really distracting, but ultimately this is something we're interested in because it's a salient user behavior that tells us something. Not, are you screen cheating, but of course, why are you screen cheating? What's the problem here, right? And of course, I don't need to tell you about observation all day. This is something you do. We want you to wander. We want you to play naturally. And when we watch you do these things, you do them differently. Not just in a quantum way, but by observing you, you're going to act differently. There is so much. There are so many more educated people than me on this topic that talk about, the role of what it means to be a game player. There are gender roles in games. There's all these things that we expect about ourselves as gamers that become performative things that we do, that become much more sensitive when we're actively watching somebody. So that's paradoxical for us in open world games because we also need this really robust, I'm going to make this a little higher. We also need this really robust data, right? Because ultimately, you have this big world that's the size of, New York City is huge. And we need this data to help us figure out how many times did players use this weapon, what was the highest rank, where were they having trouble physically, were there pathfinding bugs, where can we find those bugs? But we ultimately can't sit behind every single playtester we bring in and watch these things. And of course, on top of that, we wouldn't want to. It's a waste of a human brain to stand and tick boxes all day. We besides Jordan, we are more trained and educated than that. So we also don't want people to know they're being watched. So to some degree, the beauty of changing from industry, or excuse me, to industry from academia is that I can now actively lie to people. You know, when I was in academia, this didn't fly so much. But I can tell you that, you know, just play naturally. It's not like we're watching you through the through a window in the wall or anything. You know, well, there's 4 people watching them through a window in the wall, and that's fine to some extent. And telemetry, to me, is the ultimate lie to people because realistically, we're watching them like 1984 style. It was George Orwell's birthday earlier this year, and I sent out an email to the entire company with a security camera with a picture of a birthday hat on top of the security camera that said, "In celebration of George Orwell's birthday, just a friendly reminder that your data team is watching all of you, always." And so, you know, we're watching. We're always watching. And data like that drives what we do with our user research. So we're doing our traditional playtesting, which you're probably used to. I'm going to make sure I don't go over on time. And these are rapid play tests of little micro components of a game or a project we're building. You know, we might, if you use Saints Row as an example, I'm sorry, I'm trying to circumlocute around projects we're working on, so that's causing some stalling in my mind here. But you think about Saints Row 4, ultimately, we introduced a lot of new stuff as like super-powered traversal. People played Saints Row 4, generally speaking, most of you at least. Okay, all right, wonderful. So we moved from that traditional sort of gang sphere to this kind of like almost super-powery matrix sphere, and that changed a lot of our systems. So ultimately, iterative playtesting was necessary to be like, hey, the traversal has completely changed. Can people get around? And that's one feature. So every time a new feature comes in, we get micro tests. Now, our back-end telemetry collects data about those tests so that we have things to both refer back to after the tests have taken place, and also allows us to verify things that we've seen. So ultimately, it comes, and I'll explain a little more about our back-end in a minute. The approach we use drives discoveries about our players. We ultimately have players, obviously. There are researchers who are much less attractive than these people, and there's a back-end telemetry system. And when we put those together, we get crazy volition science that we use to power our games. So our back-end is an Apache Kafka message aggregator. And if you're familiar with this stuff, and I'm going to try to make it reasonably palatable, Apache Kafka is a many-to-many implementation of a message aggregator. So what does that mean? Most data is stored in like SQL or in some kind of relational database. You're probably all reasonably aware of this. But putting it into that database requires a really particular type of formatting and a really particular type of very clean data. And when you're dealing with hundreds of millions of players, I'm being hopeful, when you're dealing with a few dozen drunk frat boys that are playing your games, suddenly it becomes problematic to push all that data through in a really clean, neat format because those pieces get bigger and bigger exponentially. So you're familiar with the dry coding, don't repeat yourself, that whole idea. Well, data normalization says that we should only have one instance of any point of data at any given time so we don't have redundancy. And that's how we keep our backends from exploding. Kafka is wonderful at this. So what it does is an open-ish platform, like most of the Apache products, that allows us to push extremely small segments of raw data through a pipeline to our backend. So we get basically what looks like junk. That junk then goes through what's called an ETL layer, extract, transfer, and load, which is built in Python and is inserted into a MySQL database. And then eventually some guy, that little guy up there, has the duty of looking at all of that data and delivering on it, whether that is insights about our users, whether it's predictions about which demographic areas will grow year over year, whether it's linear regressions. This is all collected through the system. And yes, my desk actually looks like that little guy. There's a reason for that. They're not all connected to one computer. The top one is a server, the bottom is anyway. So when we want to track a data point, there's a process that this goes through, and I'll lead it for you. The developer, and that could be a programmer or a designer, we use a visual interface, something like Kismet, but not Kismet, to push stuff into our game. That hook gets pushed in, and then the player executes that behavior in some kind of serializable format. It gets sent to Kafka in this very ugly format. It's interpreted and passed in something like JSON, and then we use a Python-based interpreter that grabs it and pushes it into our SQL server, and then we use it for whatever. So, like a player kills an NPC. That's something that happens a lot in Saints Row. We get a message, and it looks kind of like this. So I'll give you a second to kind of swallow that. That's ugly, right? This is JSON, for those of you. I mean, it's kind of JSON. It's triple-nested JSON with a bunch of stuff that's not super relevant. And Kafka doesn't store this. It keeps it in almost like a RAM-like buffer. And when it comes through, if we don't use it, it gets dumped on the ground and never seen again. So this doesn't bog our products. Our last game that we released, Saints Row 4, besides GAT, which was complicated, but Saints Row 4, we stored everything. So problematically, when I arrived on the scene, taking a query, someone could ask me something as simple as what was the average time people spent swinging the dildo bat at somebody. That's an easy question to answer, except our database was so bogged down with redundant, non-normalized data that it would take me 3 days to run the query, even on a beast of a machine. So ultimately, that's not usable, right? And really, as a data scientist helping user researchers, what good am I if the data is not usable? It's not actionable. We need quick turnarounds on these kinds of things to iterate, and we can't iterate on something that takes days to crunch. We use a Python daemon that will turn that into SQL. And this is literally just a stalled loop. So for those of you who are coders or have coding background, you can weep for my disgusting code. But it basically stalls. I hate how in Python you have to rename a string to assign to it too. Anyway, so it dumps this in a format that's readable by SQL. And then it gets stored in SQL. And then we have a host of internal tools that access that data. So this is cleaned a little bit, but this is basically what one of our internal tools looks like. This is called Chronicler. It's a visualizer that we use in the studio. So there's about 250 people working at Volition, and when we have playtests, one of the things that Jordan has, and I'm not going to insult him this time, worked tirelessly to do is make it so that the developers really, really, really have a lot of buy-in in our user testing. People line up outside of the user lab to kind of like peek in, and they're very engaged in the fact that we have people playing and user testing. And so what ends up happening is we live stream this to the entire studio. We'll send out an email. It's like, hey, at 3 p.m., we're going to have a live test of Saints Row 17, Save Johnny Gat's Head, and you can log in and watch it at this address. And Chronicler here takes that data that I previously showed you and live crunches it to SQL with a series of visualized SQL queries that the people don't need to know any SQL. You can just be like, okay, what weapon's being used the most? And you can drag that and see it by scale. And so this is one of the many internal tools that's powered. This is almost like an Apache Kafka plug. It is wonderful. It allows us to power all these internal tools. And the bigger point is that allows us to take telemetry and empower developers to make informed decisions about the kinds of designs they're putting in from their desk, because the user research we're doing is in a fishbowl, in a way. They can both watch our players on the live stream and also watch the kind of data that's actually coming in. This also has limited heat mapping capabilities. This is a file photo because I can't show you the actual photos right now. But this is a Saints Row the 3rd or Saints Row 4, Jordan? 3. This is a Saints Row the 3rd file photo that shows you breadcrumbs. So every n seconds, a player will dump a little breadcrumb on the ground that tells us a few things, where they were, what they were equipped, that kind of thing. And so you kind of get the idea that there's kind of hot spots and that there's unused spots. And we use that in, suppose if we were using this to make Saints Row 4, we would examine these areas that have relatively little usage and understand, so every square inch of this on the screen represents hundreds of developer hours in making that spot, because when you're making an open world content game, you want really rich content in every area. You don't want to just be stale. So ultimately, every one of these pieces that has no footfalls indicates to us a failure of drawing players to this area. So we use that to inform how we, look at the next game or the next DLC or whatever. Again, I'm sorry, I'm dodging a lot of things here. This also gives us statistics about the player that you can run on a pretty quick basis. So sometimes designers, particularly like vehicle designers, weapon designers, things like that, want to know a lot about the thing they made. And I'm sure you all encountered this. Somebody comes in and says, oh, I put this cool mission in the game. Can you tell me stuff about it? So we visualize that stuff I visualize that stuff nowadays on a pretty daily basis. So these are just like most popular customizations in Saints Row and which stores were used the most and things like that. So realistically, I do kind of less data science and more like data art on a daily basis. This is a bad joke. It's fine. But basically, I spend most of my time showing people graphs. A designer comes in and asks me a question I got recently, and it's answered on the next slide. And this is one of those little sites into Volition's thinking that you can take a look at, and I'll try to not give away the baby with the bathwater. My greatest fear in giving industry talks is that I'm just going to name our project. I'm just going to say it, just in the middle of, so we're working on blah, and it's, oh my God, I'm fired. Anyway, so here is the next slide. Telemetry drives us to find out things about our players that we couldn't observe beforehand. So let me explain. This is average concurrent sessions per day on Saints Row 4, amortized by day over time. So that's 365 days you see there. There are 3 salient patterns that should immediately jump out at anybody. Maybe 4 if you're looking carefully. Any takers? Seriously, what do you think? Jordan? Spikes on weekends. That's a good eye. Yep. All those little spikes. That's Saturday and Sunday. What else do we see? You can see Christmas right here. Right here. Well, so Christmas Day, this is a little data nerd thing, doesn't actually see a lot of play. People have families and stuff. So usually you see it like early January, the Christmas bump. But this little spot here, what about this? Why is this area, this is Christmas actually. What about this area right here? What? Oh, I'm sorry, okay. Do I have a? Ah, yes. Okay, so that's what I wanted to get at. Laser pointer? Yeah. Yes. Right there. What I wanted to point out about that is that this makes a wonderful insight about our customers that we can't get by asking. And this is a follow-up to the last talk, would you buy, would you whatever. We make insights about our marketing targets based on, surveys, based on market research. But there's something here in the telemetry, an unlikely source of market data, if you think about it, that tells us something about the players that we probably couldn't have extracted out of them. We have a huge number of people. Now, bear in mind, if you know Saints Row, you shouldn't be buying this if you're under 18. So why then in summer does our playership skyrocket so much? Isn't that a funny paradox? So we learned, what's that? It's teachers. It's all teachers. Yeah, I am not endorsing anyone ignoring the ESRB rating on our product. Seriously, there's some scary shit in there. All right, so you should see the cutting room floor, actually. Right. Up here, what's wonderful about this, though, seriously, joking aside, is that this gives us insight into our users that we didn't previously have. Not only does it allow us to plan for the intensity of trying to handle the event data that comes through our servers, but it also allows us insight. Things that like, oh, hey, we know some truths now about what our players do. Clearly, they play more on the weekends. Clearly, they play at Christmas on those ginormous spikes you see up there. Clearly, that either Steam sales or something happening in the summer has a huge effect. Probably it's, kids out of school, duh. And realistically, that tells us a lot about our audience. So when we're interviewing people or when we're asking survey questions of people, we kind of know when they're not telling us the truth suddenly in a weird, big brothery way. And it allows us to contextualize the surveys that we do and the research that we do in a way that might not otherwise be possible without collecting data from them all the time. It also allows us to get at really granular stuff, which doesn't require us to stand there with a checkbox, as I've said several times. This is a summary of customization options that were used in Saints Row 4. So these are where people spent most of their time on average, and there's a confidence interval, but it's not really relevant, on average spending their time customizing things. So why is this important? Well, for plenary reasons, we want to know where we're spending our time making customizables for people. We want to know what will sell as DLC. If you look up here, like the hands get no love. Nobody's spending any time customizing their gloves. So we know that we're wasting our time, spending a lot of time making custom glove options. It seems like upper body, lower body, hair is basically it. So I guess we're all Super Nintendo gamers at heart in that sense. On the other hand, sometimes our telemetry doesn't make sense. And this is why, and this is a bit of a methodology pitch, we need that mixed method. And so this is why one of the reasons at Volition we believe that the individuals who work on our data, like me and other individuals in our connected group, should sit very closely with our researchers. This is a list of the most popular customizations, and Jordan can chime in here because this blew my mind. This was actually when I first got hired. These are the most 5 popular customizations in Saints Row the 4th. You'll see a bob for hair. You'll see Pleasantville vest. You'll see Pleasantville specs, and you'll see Pleasantville slacks. And I thought to myself, at a telemetry point of view, why are those 50s outfits so unbelievably popular in Saints Row 4? That's odd. Do we have like a lot of like vaudeville gamers who are like really want to be a 50s guy shooting people? No. In the first mission in the game, you are mandatorily assigned all these customization options. So what that means is 100% of players equip these items at some point. This is not something I would ever have known from the telemetry. I would have given someone a report that said something that was wrong, like very wrong. And ultimately, without sort of intimate knowledge of playing through the game and how the game's backend works, we miss that. And that's the collaboration between QA, user research, and telemetry that we do a lot of. So occasionally, telemetry doesn't make sense. And this is validated by our user research, sometimes by QA as well. Additionally, Anyway, so I thought you might get a kick out of that. So here's an awesome book. Those of you who have done a Ph.D. or master's degree have probably run into Creswell at some point on anything relating to human beings. Creswell is sort of the name in mixed methods research. Mixed methods research, and I get in irritating things with some of our senior folks at our publisher about this occasionally, that a method is not a methodology and a methodology is not a method. Like they're different, right? And so anyway, mixed methods research is really what we aspire to do. We aspire to triangulate our data by gathering both as much qualitative and quantitative data from them as possible, while simultaneously relaying that to stakeholders in a way that's digestible. Ultimately, we don't give academic reports to people. They're just long. Nobody reads them. So key takeaways that I'll give you here are as follows. Data science and user research need to be BFFs forever. We're always kind of a little divisive. You know, I'm Canadian, and one of the things we do when we define ourselves is with a series of nots. A Canadian will always say, I'm not American. I'm also not English, and I'm also not French. And I feel like when our identity is kind of threatened, that's what we do. We fall back on what we're not. You know, and I feel like a lot of the time as user researchers, you're a bit of an apologist in a studio because, of course, there's like 2 or 3 of us and like several hundred game developers. So we feel a little overwhelmed. And it's like, well, we're not developers, but we're also, you know, we're not marketers and we're not. So data science needs to be away from one of those knots. I think it's important that we work really closely with one another. Data triangulation benefits everybody. The data scientist who's looking through the data on the back end might see the Pleasantville thing and really have no context with which to actually interpret that. On the other hand, the people who are doing user research may be wasting their time by ticking boxes and doing things that a computer could easily do for them with just a series of little tools. We've built lots of tools for our user researchers, and we're going to continue to do it, and I think that's a really valuable relationship. In our studio, telemetry has become a completely inseparable part of our user research. It is as important as people being able to visualize it. The hooks that we put in game are developed. The spots that are missing from our data reveal what needs attention in the game, and it's part of the entire iterative process we use to actually develop. Finally, mixed methods as a methodology. So what I mean by this is that you need to adopt this from the get-go is really the punchline here. You can't kind of later on throw some quant support onto qualitative work. And furthermore, obviously, the guy who's sitting crunching numbers isn't going to, at the end of the project, want to hear about interviews. It doesn't help. This needs to be a from the ground up approach to mixed methods research and a commitment to that from the highest level. So it can be a difficult battle, but I think these two disciplines are sort of natural best buds. And that is kind of what we do at Volition. If you have questions about any of that, including the back end, any of that, I would be happy to answer them. I have 4 minutes according to my watch. So. Don't all go at once. Yes?
So with the pie chart with the hands that had a smaller sliver, so in that case, I guess, did you or would you then ask user research to look at it, because it might just be that none of the glove options were nice and nobody used it or whatever? Or?
Yes, absolutely. So unfortunately for Saints Row 4, I was not yet on the team, so a lot of this data kind of just hit the floor, and it was there. But going forward, yeah, absolutely. And in things that I can't talk about, yes, absolutely. Like if we were to see this on super cool Project A, that, you know, nobody's using the hands, why not? We're paying someone to make those hands. We're paying them well to spend lots of time making cool gloves and stuff. Like, what is that? I mean, we said the World of Warcraft thing. Everybody only wants the shoulders, right? Isn't that the gag? So we don't want that to happen to some degree, right? Like, people put a lot of work into our games. We want to make sure that, you know, it's more about the person who's making the hands too, right? Like, it enables that developer to feel like they're having an impact if we can fix that for them. So yeah, absolutely. This drives our user research, and then the user research drives the telemetry. So in the next use, I would look at the same thing and see if it's changed. Yeah.
With Kafka, do you have to have it like predefine what events you're going to be querying for later to be efficient with it, or can you kind of go back ad hoc later?
Oh, no, completely ad hoc. Well, one thing about Volition that's wonderful is everything we do is duct tape and staples. So if it is not expansible and like able to be changed on the fly, we would not be using it. So Kafka is just a message aggregator. It doesn't care what you're pushing through it. It's a stable system that sits on a server. So you have to put triggers in your code that actually spit a message. So while we're building the game, if vehicles has gotten a lot of attention recently, you know, you're playing an open world game and you're cruising along in a vehicle and like a bush stops you dead. So we figured out an interesting way to track that by just taking, anytime the velocity drops by a certain speed, over a certain number of seconds, we throw an event with a geolocator, and then I can visualize that over the top and be like, oh, there's a problem, there's a problem, there's a problem, and we fix that. But ultimately, no, you can expand it whenever. I mean, I'll put an event in myself if I feel like it's missing. Yeah.
What did you have to normalize to actually make this data tractable? In your ETL data, you talked about there being way too much in there before, and how you normalize the data. What did you keep?
Okay, so there's a little bit of a tale of volition here. We created a system where anybody can push stuff to our build. So imagine like a GitHub where there's only a master. That's what we've got going, and it's dangerous and terrifying. But what this means is a designer who doesn't really know anything about the back end might be really interested in seeing like when players use like a shop purchase option, whatever. So when they go in and buy weapons at Friendly Fire, they might pass a bunch of data that we already have. Like they'll pass like, oh, this is the weapon they had equipped when they went in. This was the gender of the player. When a great example is the Saints Row 4 data. Every single breadcrumb had the player's gender, which doesn't change. So it's just wasted space, right? So what we do is extrapolative backend data. So when you equip a weapon, for example, an event gets thrown that says weapon equipped, the type of weapon, the time, and your session. There's like a binding key, like an index key. And so that pivot key lets us know, I don't need to know, for example, when you shoot someone then, what weapon you have equipped, because I just look for the most recent weapon equipped event in the session. So that's part of our entire normalization to make sure that that doesn't explode on the back end. So we've stripped everything. People will put in insane things. I'm the shepherd of data in the sense that I have to go through and look at these things and kind of normalize them on a daily basis. But the beautiful part of Kafka is it doesn't store them anywhere. So as long as it's not on my SQL server, it's gone. Hope that answers the question. I have to talk around this kind of stuff. I'm sorry. Any more? I could take one more. No? Okay. Perfect. Thank you for your time.